these people are in combat, Senator, and I think that we need to say that clearly.
Defense Secretary Ash Carter telling a congressional committee about the increased U.S. military role in the fight against ISIS. And we're back now with the panel. Well, we got bad news this week. Navy SEAL Charles Keating IV was killed in northern Iraq. He's the third U.S. service member to die since the campaign against ISIS began. Brit, the White House continues to say this is not a combat mission. Isn't that getting to be harder and harder to maintain?
Yes, it is, Chris, but I don't think we should be believing here that what we really have is some kind of a covert, serious, major combat undertaking. The president is clearly doing this in very, very small steps, and I don't think he intends to go beyond that. And you know, you're always reminded of the slippery slope that we've encountered in other conflicts, where you start with a few, and the next thing you know, it's a few more, and pretty soon it's many, and pretty soon you're in full-fledged combat role. I don't sense that will come here. It is getting a little bit silly for the White House to say that this is not combat, and you got the Secretary of Defense saying something else. I mean, that's just absurd. But I don't think we should believe that President Obama is going to be waging any major wars here.
But it is more than just these few tragic deaths, Julie. President Obama recently announced that he's sending 250 more special ops forces. I think there were already 50 on the ground, now 250 more special ops forces to Syria. Our military advisors are working more closely with Iraqi troops and closer to the front lines on battlefield decisions. We've got A-10s and F-16s dropping bombs on ISIS positions. Forget the critics who may think they're either doing too much or too little. Do they, at the White House, do they worry about the slippery slope and mission creep, and that we're slowly getting sucked back into a greater involvement?
Yeah, I think they are mindful of it, but it gets to Brit's point. They are mindful of it in the sense that they just do not want to get into a position and have our military posture be like it was under the Bush administration in the Middle East. So that is always kind of the thing that they look at as the barrier. I think what you've seen happen, though, is they sometimes take smaller steps to avoid the idea that they are on a slippery slope and that they are building towards some kind of larger combat role. And you do have to ask, 100 people, 200 people, how much difference does that make? Should they be going larger, and do they not go larger because they do want to avoid the idea of being on a slippery slope?
I mean, they are in a kind of a mess of their own making, aren't they, Kim, in the sense that if you send these troops in such small numbers into Iraq and Syria, then some people are going to say, you know, it's a Band-Aid, and on the other hand, if they send more, the people are saying, well, you know, they're not doing enough.
Look, you go back to June 2014, the president said he was going to send 275 uniformed personnel. We're now up to more than 4,100 in Iraq. And by the way, people in Congress say that the number is actually quite higher because of the way they do temporary troop rotations, and that the White House is hiding the real numbers that are over there. We are at a war. The president doesn't want to admit it because he doesn't want to have to come out, and he promised the American people that this was not something he was going to do. So instead, he's sliding along, hoping to get to the end of the term because he wants this legacy to be able to say, I pulled this out. In the meantime, his vow to dismantle ISIS, he has not committed the reinforcements that you need there to make that happen, and now the conflict is spreading to Syria, Afghanistan, everywhere you look.
Kim, I want to turn to a revealing profile in today's New York Times Sunday magazine. It's about Ben Rhodes, who is not a household name, but he's one of President Obama's top foreign policy advisors. Rhodes says the White House spun a false narrative to sell the Iran nuclear deal, claiming that they had worked with moderates when Rouhani took over, when in fact they had been dealing for 2 years before that with the hardliners, even including Ahmadinejad and the Supreme Leader. How big a deal that you've got the President's Deputy National Security Advisor basically saying, we misled the American people on how this all came down?
Big deal, because that is, in essence, what they are saying, that the president had the objective from the minute he walked into office of cutting a deal with Iran so that he could further disengage from the region, and then used the excuse of this election in which everyone understood that there were not moderates necessarily elected. This was not some major change in the regime there, but they spun that to the public as an excuse to then pull the pin on this. Revealing, although not necessarily surprising for anybody who has actually watched this administration, because their foreign policy does tend to be mostly spin.
And does it make a difference? In other words, if you does it make the Iran nuclear deal more objectionable to know that they began negotiating it with?
It was objectionable from the start. Yes, and now we just know that, in fact, what drove that deal were not, in fact, a series of imperatives about how we were, in fact, trying to change the behavior of the Iranians, but simply getting a deal, which is not one that's in the long-term benefit of the United States or any of the members of the region.
And Rhodes also brags in this piece, it's worth looking at, it's online, about how the White House was able to get the media to tell its narrative. This is what Rhodes says. This is a quote from him in the article. The average reporter we talk to is 27 years old, and their only reporting experience consists of being around political campaigns. That's a sea change. Those 27-year-old reporters, I'm glad to say, I know you'll be surprised I'm not one of them, they literally know nothing. Chuck, what do you make of that?
The know-nothing.
Well, you know, it's not new that a White House would spin reporters and try to mold them to its narrative. It's a little new that they would be so brazen about it, and it's really new that they would brag and express such contempt for the media that they deal with. I must say, you know, that description he offers of the people he was dealing with could almost have fit Ben Rhodes himself when he arrived at the White House. He was a little older than 27, but he had no particular foreign policy experience and had come up through campaigns. You know, there used to be a norm.
And prided himself on being a novelist, a storyteller.
A storyteller, and somebody who was unburdened, really, by political, or rather foreign policy experience. Because another thing he says in this piece is that there's something in Washington he calls the blob, which is, you know, sort of all the talking heads and foreign policy establishment people. And I must say, I think there's something to that. It was kind of a refreshing dose of irreverence by Ben Rhodes there. The people had made a lot of mistakes in Iraq, and I can understand that. But, you know, nevertheless, there were some very seasoned people out there, some of them like Leon Panetta and Bob Gates, who helped this president, or at least tried to, and probably don't deserve to be thought of as part of a blob.
Julie, have you, since this article came out, have you talked to people at the White House?
Yeah, I mean, you know, it's interesting because this White House really prides themselves on being kind of the smartest kid in the room. That's kind of their approach to so many things. They take that approach in dealing with the media, in dealing with Capitol Hill, in dealing with think tanks. I think that what you saw in this article is a little bit of how the sausage is made, which is always kind of an ugly thing to look at. But I think that they look at this article, and I think that they will probably take the criticism of it, which is plenty and coming from people that are even friendly to them, as just another example of how Washington doesn't get what the Obama administration is trying to do. They really have this attitude, frankly, that they are the only smart ones in town and the only ones who kind of understand the goals
because I thought you were going to tell me that they're in a cold fury about what Ben Rhodes said.
No, they're. I think that they are, if anything, being pretty defensive of what he said. Maybe they don't necessarily like the way he said some of it, but I don't necessarily think that they disagree with the larger message of the piece and what he was saying.
It is a different world in which we live when a White House staffer promoted in this piece as someone who is largely anonymous, who has actually been anything but anonymous, and he's one of the most widely quoted figures in Washington, allows a profile like this to come out and build him up, and which I think the White House probably approves of and agrees with most of what he said, especially about the media. And I think it's, you know, they didn't realize that the criticism was coming, and Julie, you've said that, and here it is, and I think they were a little surprised by it because I think this is their little star, this young whippersnapper, smart though he may be. Ben Rhodes comes out, and
there you go. That the 27-year-old doesn't talk about whippersnappers.
Yeah, I'm sort of the opposite of
yes,
him. He's 27, I'm 72,
are.
right? So, but I think this is something different, and it's a reflection of the president himself. In fact, Rhodes is said to be in a constant state of mind meld with the president, and he says in the article that he doesn't know where the president ends and he begins, or vice versa.
Like a blob.
These are quite blob. Yes, these are quite extravagant claims this young man makes for himself here. Maybe they're true, but what's remarkable about it is that the White House is on board, it seems to me, with all of it.
I commend the article to you. Thank you, panel. See you next Sunday.